Hello everyone, welcome back. This topic is going to be talking about the Aztecs, or the people that became known as the Aztecs. We'll be talking about their cosmovision, as well as a bit of their historical context as well. And we'll be doing that across a couple of videocast or lecture segments. So in the last series of videocast lecture segments, we got our cosmological ball rolling with the Maya and the Popol Vuh. And if you remember, one of the key tropes that came up was the notion of cycles of time. And this is something that over the next few weeks, or the next few sessions, you'll be noticing in the texts that you're reading and also in the discussions that we have, that it's a pattern that comes up over and again in indigenous American cosmovisions in a very definite way. It's very visible. But, as I mentioned last time, it's also one that if you scratch the surface just a little, you'll see it as well in the European Christian cosmovision of the 16th and 17th centuries. Up until recently, actually. So just to recap some of the things we mentioned. These cycles refer to cycles of life and death that shape the way the divine is perceived, but which also shape the world and the interaction between the world and the divine. So to reiterate, the two most important things to consider are, well, they might not be the most important, but two things that are really quite important, that I consider to be important anyway. First one is that time itself is cyclical. It's not linear. And this is much easier to see in indigenous cosmovisions. But if you look closely enough, it can also be seen in the Christian cosmovision. And as I mentioned in the earlier series of podcast, it combines a series of yearly ritual cycles together that come together in a linear fashion. Now, the second thing to bear in mind is because time is cyclical, created matter, i.e. the universe, which if you think about it can't actually exist out of time, is also a part of these cycles. And this also includes the gods, as whilst they're themselves creators. In the indigenous American cosmovisions, they're intimately linked with the world and its fate, or the universe and its fate. So what you see in these cosmovisions are ways of depicting cycles of destruction and rebirth, death and life. Now at this point, I'm going to introduce another concept, another challenge, a conceptual challenge. Let's see if we can get our heads around it, which is the concept of evil. And that's something we have to get away from if we're going to think about the indigenous American cosmovisions. So those of us that have our cultural roots in Europe and the Middle East often think that good and evil are things that oppose each other and strive to destroy each other. And that's often a mistaken idea about Christianity. It's a mistake to apply that dualism to Christianity, or it's often done, because in actual fact Christian philosophy and theology worked out as early as the 4th century following Augustine. In this theology, evil isn't actually something that has any tangible existence. Rather, it's a lack of good, a lack of being, a lack of perfection. So this is something that Augustine worked out and stayed in Orthodox Christianity up until the present day. The problem is, because it's a complicated idea, the inherent dualism, the kind of conflict between good and evil, has really kind of been foregrounded, and this is what's come. This is how we often understand Christianity today, and how it often has been understood. So that's something we can come back to later when we talk about Christianity, later in the series when we talk about Christianity. But if we return to the indigenous American cosmovisions, our challenge is to understand that in a similar way, the concept of evil doesn't exist. There is no evil in the indigenous American cosmovisions. What does exist, for sure, is chaos, destruction, and death. And people might have been, and I'm almost 100% sure that they were, very, very afraid of these things. But this isn't what we would consider to be evil per se. Because if we return to the notion of cycles and cyclical time, in indigenous American cosmovisions, and the Aztec cosmovision is no exception to this, chaos, destruction, and death are utterly intrinsic to order, creation, and life. You can't have one half without the other. There can be no creation without it being preceded and followed by destruction. That's simply a necessary part of the cycle. It's a dualism in a way, as we talked about in the last series of podcasts when we looked at the Popol Vuh. And so this is what we're going to be looking at in this series, in this two-part series about the Aztecs. We'll be looking at the divine cycle of destruction and rebirth, chaos and order, death and life from the Aztec perspective. Now, this is something you see absolutely everywhere in the Aztec world, in the artwork, in the sculptures, in the chronicles and narratives that have survived until the present day. And I suppose it's very easy to become fixated on the blood and gore of the human sacrifices that were so prominent in Aztec society. But what you have to bear in mind is that these sacrifices were part of something bigger, a wider framework that encompassed these sacrifices and placed them in a context that enabled the peoples of Central Mesoamerica to make sense of the world around them and to coexist with that world and to survive as well. Okay, so how do we explain this? Where can we start? Well, I'll start with an example. And appropriately, you might say, it's the beginning of the Aztecs, and I place that in inverted commas, as they became known, because they didn't self-refer, they didn't self-identify as Aztec. This is something that it's a terminology that became prominent in the late 17th century and then kind of stuck then. Anyway, this example that I was going to give you really refers to the origins of the Toltecs that I mentioned last time, and the Mexica, who claimed the heritage of the Toltecs as their own. Now, before I get into the Cosmovision side of things, I'll briefly give you a chronology of the people we now refer to as Aztecs. So last time I mentioned that a key civilization in Mesoamerica was the Teotihuacan Civilization that controlled a vast empire from about 100 AD, our calendar that is, to approximately 600, 650 AD when its hegemony collapsed. And what happened then was waves of ethnic migrations from the north shifted the balance of power to another hegemony, which was that of the Toltecs, who were based at Tula or Toyang, which was and this civilization was at its peak in the 11th century. Again, this is our calendar, the Western European calendar. And one of the latest groups to migrate south was the Mexica, who appear to have entered the Valley of Mexico after the fall of Tula in roughly 1200 AD. The Mexica, they were a warlike group and they fought their way around the lake. They settled where they could. They made alliances with various city-states where they could, and they were moved on often violently by the settled city-states. And they were trying to survive until, after a significant misunderstanding, they were driven onto an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco by the Acolwa hegemony based at Culhuacan, where they became established by the mid-13th century in a dual settlement called Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco. And due to their proximity to the western side of the lake, the Mexica became vassals of the Tepanec hegemony. That's based at the main city-state where the central city-state where the Tepanec hegemony was based was Azcapotzalco. And so the Mexica were vassals of the Tepanecs until 1428, our calendar, when they shifted alliances. They overthrew the Tepanecs and exploded, not literally obviously, but they exploded into the Valley of Mexico as a new hegemonic power. And this power was known as the Triple Alliance, and it was between three city-states, Tenochtitlan, Tlacopan, or Tlacuba, depending on the chronicles that you use to identify the city-state, and also Texcoco, so Tenochtitlan, Tlacopan, Tlacuba, and Texcoco. And the conquest that these city-states go on to make became known as the Aztec Empire, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. For now, though, I'll point out that the Mexica, or the Aztecs as they became known, linked their own origins with those of the Toltecs at Tula. And they also conflated the archaeological sites of the Toltecs with those of the Teotihuacan Civilization. So if we return to the Toltecs and their origins, which was understood by the Mexicas their own origins as well, I'm going to show you an image from the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca. Now normally, if I was live in front of a group, I'd ask them there and then what they saw in this image. And I'll give you a moment to think about it. Yes, you see a cave. Yes, you see footprints. Yes, you see people. But you could say something about it as well. And at this point, I tend to prod them back to thinking about secondary or high school and basic biology classes, where you might have been given a pretty rubbish diagram that looked a bit like this. And perhaps it was a bit better than this. But certainly what you've got is a kind of triangular shape with padded sides and an opening underneath. Yeah, and that comes from your basic biology classes. So if you flick back to the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca and this image here, what's being depicted is not only the story of a group of people said to have emerged from a cave, that's what you can see, but the image of the cave is overlaid with the image of a womb. So these people are born from the earth, and their guides, incidentally, Ixicóatl, which translates as serpent's foot, and Quetzalteoyac, or great green feather, also overlap onto the duality of the gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, who I'll come back to again later. Now, notice a detail. Notice the footprints. Footprints are in fact a common sight in Aztec codices. They represent the journey through time as well as space. So here's another example which depicts the journey of the Mexica, who, as I've said, became leaders of the Aztec world. So they journey from the mythic Aztlan, or the place of the heron, to the Valley of Mexico, Chapultepec, which translates as Grasshopper Hill, which is now in central Mexico City. And this is the journey of their origins, their origin journey. Now, if you notice, though, in the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca, how these footprints, they leave the cave, they reach a certain point, and then they turn around and go back in. So what it isn't saying is that the Toltecs were cavemen who decided to go for a wander and then went back into their caves. It isn't saying that. It's actually describing the origin of the Toltecs in a context that also depicts their end. Remember, you can't have birth without death, or creation without destruction. So what it's saying is, the Toltecs are born of the Earth Mother, and they return to the Earth Mother when they die. It's a very realistic and pragmatic way of viewing the world. Now, I've gone and said that word, or that title, Earth Mother. And one of the things we've got to be very careful about when we look at cosmovisions that aren't our own is not to superimpose our own visions of particular concepts onto other people's. Now, arguably, the Spanish did something very similar, but they did something. But you can argue this, but in fact, they did something quite different, because we're seeing one word which is common to both worldviews, the Earth Mother, and imagining it in a certain way, our own way. By contrast, the Spanish saw a thing and imagined that it correlated to particular words and concepts that didn't actually exist in the indigenous worldview. But, I mean, you could argue that's semantics, but we'll discuss that in more detail later on in this series of discussions or talks. So anyway, back to the Earth Mother. I'll lay odds that when I mentioned the name, some of you'd already had an idea of what you thought she was. I wouldn't be surprised if you thought of something like this image central to Rubens and Bruegel's 16th century painting that depicts her like this. It's a classic fertility goddess. Or some of you with more of a history background, an ancient history background, might have imagined a Sheila na gig, a Celtic fertility goddess, not at all pretty in the classical sense of the word, but certainly suggestive of reproduction. And of course, what most people would imagine, perhaps, as a new agey, waify-like beauty which is worthy of a shop window in Glastonbury. If you imagine that, forget it all. Just just put it straight out of your minds. It's not that. The Aztec Earth Mother, well, to describe her, it's worth reading you this, a depiction from Fernando Cervantes' book, The Devil in the New World. So he writes, the goddess Tlaltecutli, the Earth Lady, was the palpable rock, soil and slime on which men lived, but she was also the earth into which they were lowered at death. Revered on the one hand as a benign source of food and life, in art she was depicted as a gargantuan toad, slavering blood and displaying clashing jaws at every joint in a dramatic representation of chaos. So yeah, the jaws on every limb, they're to grind up the bones of the dead. And notice also the red line going into her mouth in this image of Tlaltecutli, which was unearthed from underneath the great temple, or Templo Mayor, in the Plaza de Armas, or the Plaza Mayor in Mexico City, which is underneath what's now the cathedral. This red line going into her mouth, it's not a tongue, it's a trail of blood on which she feeds. So the Earth Lady gives birth to humans, and you can see that by her squatting stance. But she feeds on their flesh and bones and on the blood of the sacrificed. And that brings us on to another extremely important aspect of the Aztec Cosmovision, which is sacrifice. And that's what we'll continue with in the next podcast or videocast.